It was 1932 when the auctioneer hesitated, an unspoken tremor passing through the room as the final item was unveiled. A portrait, large and dust-veiled, depicting a Victorian family frozen in eerie stillness. Their expressions weren't neutral, they were watching. A mother clutching a lace fan with fingers too long, a father with one hand behind his back, hiding something. And at the center, a red cradle. No baby, just a blurred smudge, as if the painter had recoiled before finishing. No one bid, not even the antique dealers who prided themselves on collecting cursed things. The auction house marked it unsold. Weeks later, the portrait vanished. For decades, the Blackwell name has remained a whisper, stitched into Missouri folklore and erased from official records. Who were they really? What happened in that house behind the iron gates? And why does every path into their past seem paved with missing pages and sealed lips? This isn't just a family history. It's a descent into surgical obsessions, spiritual rot, and a legacy soaked in silence. You've heard of haunted houses. This one was built by haunted people. The Blackwell estate was not merely constructed, it was imposed. In 1842, Dr. Elijah Blackwell purchased a stretch of fertile Missouri land for a fraction of its value, raising eyebrows even then. What few questioned was why the land had been abandoned so suddenly. Beneath the lush soil and spring-fed hills lay the blackened bones of a Quapaw village, reduced to ash by a fire no one claimed to set. Officially, the tragedy was blamed on lightning. Unofficially, locals whispered of something older, something sacred desecrated, something that screamed as it burned. Blackwell paid no mind. With wealth inherited from wartime medicine and whispered family money, Elijah began construction of his manor, a 3-story Victorian edifice surrounded by wrought iron fences and curtain, a garden arranged in perfect spirals. The house stood like a monument to triumph or intrusion. Early visitors remarked how the walls seemed too silent, the air oddly cold even in summer. A carpenter fell from the 3rd floor while installing a gable and swore with his last breath that someone had pushed him. No one was there. Blackwell himself was often seen surveying the land at night, muttering to himself, sometimes sketching symbols into the dirt and covering them before dawn. His journals described the property as cleansed, but waiting. Of what, he never said. There was no chapel in the house's original plans, yet within 2 years, one was constructed below ground, accessed only by a narrow stone staircase. Locals weren't allowed near it. What prayers were said there and to whom remain unanswered. What is clear, however, is this. The house was not designed for comfort, but for control. Every door locked from the outside, every corridor twisted just slightly off-center. The windows were tall, but offered no view of the front gate. The land bore fruit, but none of the neighboring farmers would trade with the family. They claimed the soil was wrong, that things grew too fast, ripened too soon, and spoiled unnaturally. Blackwell's response: time bends to purpose. On paper, it was a beautiful estate. In reality, it was a monument built on the bones of the forgotten, fueled by denial, secrecy, and the first hints of the madness to come. Dr. Elijah Blackwell arrived in town with polished boots and a reputation soaked in glory. A former Civil War surgeon, he was hailed as both a miracle worker and a man unafraid of blood. Veterans whispered about his uncanny ability to keep the dying alive, though not always whole. He could amputate a leg in under 3 minutes and never flinch at the screams. His smile, thin, deliberate, lingered too long on the faces of those in PT. He claimed it calmed them. Most said it chilled the room. After the war, he reinvented himself as a gentleman physician, opening a private practice beside the estate. But his surgical records from 1865 to 1871 are missing. Gone, too, are the names of dozens of patients reportedly under his care. What survived were sketches, grotesquely detailed anatomical renderings, often labeled imperfect or unsalvageable, alongside private notations like prefrontal decay or weakness of will. His obsession wasn't healing. It was correction. He believed defects, physical, moral, even spiritual, could be cut away. That sin had a shape, and with enough precision, it could be removed like a tumor. At dinner parties, he spoke not of recovery, but of design. How the body's flaws reflected a deeper disorder. How evolution could be guided by force. The townspeople remained polite, but wary. Children avoided him. Animals seemed to recoil. One maid claimed she found jars in his study, jars filled with what looked like infant hands, preserved in amber fluid. She vanished before the sheriff could speak to her. Blackwell's smile was most unsettling when he was quiet. It didn't fade when someone cried. It didn't waver during funerals or when tragedy struck. It stayed fixed, too calm, too certain, as if he knew something the rest of them didn't. In his private writings, he often referenced the original child, a term never explained but always capitalized. He believed in purity, not moral, but anatomical. He wrote of symmetry as salvation. That nature failed sometimes, and man must step in. He wasn't a doctor in the traditional sense. He was a sculptor with a scalpel, chasing some silent internal design, smiling all the while. And behind that smile, the Blackwell legacy began to curdle. From the outside, the Blackwell children lived a charmed life, tucked behind iron gates, dressed in lace and velvet, tutored in piano and Latin. But anyone who caught a glimpse through the hedges said the same thing. They never cried. Not when they fell, not when they were scolded, not even when one was stung by a hornet and the welt swelled purple across his cheek. They simply stared, wide-eyed, obedient, eerily quiet. 4 children were acknowledged by the town, Thomas, Evelyn, Clara, and Nathaniel, but whispers suggested there were more. Midwives recalled unregistered births. Neighbors spoke of lullabies echoing through shuttered windows long after the last child had supposedly been born. Once, a nursemaid named Lillian threw herself from the attic window. She survived just long enough to mutter, "They don't sleep, they just watch." Her death was ruled hysteria. The family said she'd suffered fits. Visitors to the home often left unsettled. A schoolteacher invited to tutor the children privately noted in her diary, "They speak in perfect cadence but never ask questions. The youngest stared at me for 10 minutes without blinking. I checked. I timed it." She resigned within a week. Their portraits, commissioned yearly, never showed smiles. The painter, a French émigré, returned to Paris mid-contract, refusing payment. He left behind one incomplete canvas, in which the children's eyes had been painted last, and only one had pupils. The others remained blank, waiting. What happened behind the walls was only partially guessed. A kitchen maid claimed to hear chanting from the cellar on certain nights, soft voices like lullabies sung backward. Another reported seeing one of the boys carrying a dead fox into the house, wrapped in linens like an infant. When asked, he only said, "It's for Father's lesson." No child ever ran in the yard. No laughter echoed across the veranda. And no Blackwell child was ever seen playing with others in town. Their world was inward, silent, and strangely synchronized, as though bound by something deeper than blood. It wasn't just that they didn't cry. It was that they didn't seem to need to. Whatever emotions ordinary children couldn't contain, the Blackwell children had long since buried or had buried for them. Once a month, without fail, the Blackwells hosted what they called their ancestral suppers. Invitations were never sent, yet guests, usually town elites or distant family, knew to arrive just before dusk. The dining room, an elongated hall lined with portraits too large for the walls, was set with 12 chairs. Only 8 were ever filled by the living. The remaining 4 sat undisturbed but carefully prepared, cutlery placed, goblets filled, napkins folded. No one acknowledged them. When newcomers asked, they were met with tight smiles and sips of wine. The food was always underseasoned, the wine oddly metallic. Conversation floated in hushed tones, circling history, lineage, and phrases like purity through obedience. One guest, a visiting journalist named Morris Adderley, later published a letter to a colleague claiming he saw someone, or something, crawl beneath the table mid-meal. He thought it a prank until he saw the same movement reflected in the silver of his spoon, a child's hand, pale and still, brushing past his shoe. That was the last letter Adderley ever wrote. He disappeared 3 nights later. His satchel was found in the woods near the estate, torn open, pages missing. The sheriff searched for him, but the family claimed he'd never arrived. They even produced a letter, forged, stating he'd canceled his visit. The ink hadn't dried yet. Other dinner guests, over the years, would report strange phenomena, forks bending inward, portraits changing subtly between courses, one chandelier flickering only when someone mentioned Eliza, the eldest daughter. A local banker claimed he heard a child whispering prayers in Latin under the table. When he confronted Elijah Blackwell, the doctor only replied, "Faith begins in the small ones." What unnerved people most wasn't the food, or the shadows, or the cold drafts that seemed to snake across ankles mid-toast. It was the silence, the unwavering politeness, the sense that everyone there knew the rules but refused to say them aloud. When the final course was served, always a white pudding, always untouched by the family, the 4 empty chairs would be cleared in perfect unison by unseen hands. The guests were thanked. The candles were snuffed, and the Blackwell children would retreat in step, eyes forward into the unlit hallway behind the kitchen door. Beneath the Blackwell estate, past the chapel staircase and through a warped oak door, lay a room no servant dared enter. It was referred to only as the back cellar, though no one could remember what it stored. Its door was sealed with rusted chains and marked with a symbol that didn't match any known religion, 2 intersecting loops with a vertical slash. Even Elijah Blackwell's detailed estate diagrams omitted it, as if the room itself was an afterthought or a correction. In 1903, during plumbing renovations after flooding damaged the lower level, a team of workers pried it open. The first thing they noticed was the smell, metallic but not of rot. The walls were stone, damp and pitted, with large iron rings bolted at irregular intervals. Manacles. A stain ran across the center of the floor, long and black, too deep to be just mold. One worker, a man named Ellis Keene, reportedly fled the house and never returned to collect his wages. The others refused to speak about what they'd found except for the youngest, who said one word to his wife before leaving town: teeth. No report was ever filed. The foreman was paid in cash and the room was resealed by morning. The family claimed ignorance. Dr. Blackwell, then in his early 60s, laughed off rumors. "It's an old meat locker," he said. "We've no use for it now." Yet the temperature in that room was oddly warm. Candles refused to stay lit. And when the maids passed by the sealed door, they claimed to hear soft tapping from within, like fingers on glass. Decades later, during a demolition survey, A structural engineer documented stress damage near the same foundation. He recorded a strange acoustic resonance, an echo that repeated his words out of sync, as if mimicked by a second mouth in a smaller room. He declined further work and changed professions 6 months later. No repairs were ever made. No furniture was stored there. The cellar remained untouched, and when asked why, the family's only surviving caretaker simply said, "Some rooms aren't for repair, they're for remembering." And so it sat, sealed, silent, and still listening, beneath a house already rotting from the inside out. The first known photograph of the Blackwell family, dated 1878, is an artifact of unease. Taken in front of the estate's west garden, the image appears normal at first. Elijah Blackwell in a stiff collar, his wife stoic beside him, the children arranged in rigid posture. But look closely, and the discomfort begins to spread. The shadows fall in opposite directions. The youngest child's feet don't touch the ground, and in the upper right-hand corner, in the reflection of the parlor window, a face appears, one not belonging to any known family member. By the 1970s, a small collection of these images surfaced during a university archive project. A graduate student named Joan Halper began cataloging them. In her journal, she described how the photos altered under prolonged viewing. One child's eyes shifted slightly closer together. A hand that once rested on a lap now curled downward, pointing. She said with growing dread that every photo included at least one element not reflected in the estate's blueprints. A doorway where none existed, a staircase angled the wrong way. Then, there was the mirror. One photo in particular featured Clara Blackwell standing before the grand hallway mirror. Her reflection did not match her pose. Her hand, lifted in reality, was lowered in the glass. Worse still, the reflection showed another child, older, gaunter, standing behind her, though no such child appeared in the room. Joan Halper died in a house fire 1 week after sending her findings to the university's history department. The fire marshal reported no signs of arson, but couldn't explain the scorched symbols found on the carpet near her desk, the same intersecting loops seen on the Blackwell cellar door. Her research, mostly destroyed, survived only in fragments. Other researchers who viewed the photographs reported headaches, brief memory loss, and a recurring dream of standing in a long hallway filled with locked doors. One man claimed he saw a figure blink at him from inside a negative. The Blackwell photographs are now kept under restricted access, not because of their monetary value, but because they refuse to remain still, as if the house captured in them is still breathing, still watching, and still waiting to be remembered on its own terms. Officially, the Blackwells had 4 children. Their names were inscribed in church ledgers, recorded in census rolls, and referenced in town diaries. But in 1871, a midwife filed a single, unsigned entry in a private ledger now housed in the county archive. Male infant, born alive, delivered at 2:14 a.m. unnamed, taken below. No baptism followed, no announcement, no burial record, just that lone line and silence. In Dr. Elijah Blackwell's surviving surgical journal, dated a week after that birth, there appears a strange and clinical note. The skin regenerates faster than expected. Eye formation irregular but responsive. Spine curvature acceptable. The entry is marked not under patient, but under specimen. No name, only a drawing, a child's silhouette, disproportionate and crossed with measurement lines. Years later, rumors spread among staff. Servants swore they heard crying at night, but not from the nursery, from the cellar. One claimed to have seen muddy footprints that led up from the basement but ended nowhere. Another recalled finding small garments, damp and torn, inside the dumbwaiter. When she reported it to Mrs. Blackwell, she was dismissed without severance. Children from nearby farms began speaking of the quiet boy who lived behind the hedges. He didn't talk, they said, but he smiled when you hurt yourself. One girl went missing for 2 days, found asleep in the orchard with scratch marks on her back. She wouldn't speak for a month. When she finally did, all she said was, "He wanted to know what I felt like." As the other Blackwell children matured into hollow-eyed teenagers, the fifth was never spoken of, not even by name. But in the attic, carved faintly into the underside of a dresser, were 3 words: "He is patient." The question is not just who the fifth child was, but why he was hidden. A failed experiment? A successful one? Something too unnatural even for Elijah Blackwell's twisted pride. One theory persists in hushed circles, that Elijah believed this child would be the culmination of his doctrine, not merely corrected, but perfected, something no longer fully human, yet undeniably his. Whatever he became, he was not meant for sunlight. He was meant for the dark rooms, the locked ones, the ones no one repaired. Long after the Blackwell children vanished, from town view, stories of their presence lingered, especially among other children. They spoke of a game played in the orchard behind the estate, always at dusk, always in silence. It was called the marionette game. According to local lore, the Blackwell children would stand in a circle, arms rigid, heads tilted at unnatural angles. One child, the body, stood blindfolded in the center, held upright by strings tied to their limbs and controlled by the others. No laughter, no rules spoken aloud, just a slow, synchronized mimicry of movement. Sometimes, a second circle would form, children kneeling in the grass, faces turned upward, as if waiting for instruction from above. Witnesses claimed the children moved too fluidly, as if they'd rehearsed for years. One farmer, passing on horseback, said he saw a boy floating slightly above the ground, strings taut to trees that swayed in windless air. A local boy named Aaron Kessler once tried to join. He was found hours later behind the Blackwell hedges, limbs twisted as if pulled by invisible cords. His shoulder had been dislocated, his knees bore rope burns. He never spoke again. His mother claimed he whispered in his sleep for months. "I was the body. I was the body." An old doll, recovered decades later from the Blackwell grounds, had pins inserted at each joint and thin red threads knotted around its wrists and ankles. When tested, the threads were found to contain trace elements of human blood. Its eyes had been gouged out, replaced with beads made from bone. The symbolism was not lost on historians. The Blackwell children were not merely disciplined, they were orchestrated, controlled, trained in obedience until their very identities blurred. The marionette game wasn't a game at all. It was a ritual, a rehearsal for a life where every movement was someone else's command. What's most chilling is how many children in the Surah rounding area claim to have played it too, as if the pattern spread like an infection, a psychological virus seeded through imitation. Or maybe it wasn't imitation at all. Maybe the Blackwell children weren't the first to play it, just the most willing. In 1891, a crumbling orphanage on the edge of St. Louis received a curious request from Dr. Elijah Blackwell. He offered to take in select wards from overcrowded facilities, children deemed unplaceable due to behavioral issues, deformities, or lack of family history. On paper, it sounded like philanthropy. In reality, It was procurement. Over the next 3 years, a quiet trickle of children was sent to what was euphemistically referred to as the Blackwell Sanctuary. The nuns who arranged the transfers began noticing something strange. No letters came back, no drawings, no photos. The few attempts at follow-up visits were stonewalled by a polite but firm lawyer who cited medical privacy and spiritual transition. One nun, Sister Magdalene, ignored protocol and wrote directly to the diocese, "The children do not return. I fear they are being used. I fear they are being changed." Her letter was dismissed as hysteria. Weeks later, she suffered a stroke and lost the ability to speak. She died 6 months after. Her last written phrase, scrawled tremblingly on a prayer card, was, "They took their voices." Only one child ever re-entered the system. A boy named Luke, 6 years old, found wandering along a road 5 miles from the Blackwell estate. He was barefoot, hair shaved, and wearing a shirt that had been sewn shut at the sleeves, arms forced to stay folded. When questioned, he repeated a single phrase: "The hands do bad things." He was later adopted, but his night terrors never stopped. In one episode, he screamed that his bones were whispering again. When shown a photo of the Blackwell family, he began vomiting. The orphanage eventually stopped sending children, not because they questioned the Blackwells, but because there were none left to send. Each transfer had quietly whittled away the most vulnerable. The paper trail was deliberately sparse, and what remained was riddled with euphemisms. Transferred for care, relocated under medical supervision, delivered unto the sanctuary, delivered like goods, like offerings. What Blackwell did to those children is unknown, but the language tells its own story. They weren't adopted, they weren't returned, and they weren't missed. They were absorbed into a house that fed on silence, that punished individuality, and that repurposed flesh for something far more sinister than family. In 1912, after decades of decay, the Blackwell family chapel underwent discreet renovations. Nestled beneath the estate grounds, the chapel had long been closed to outsiders, its heavy iron doors rusted shut, its windows permanently blackened with soot from candles that, some said, never went out. When laborers were finally allowed in, they expected little more than structural rot. What they found was something else entirely. As they pulled up the stone tiles near the altar to access warped foundation beams, their tools struck something hollow. Beneath the floor lay a shallow chamber, unmarked, unblessed, and entirely out of place. Inside were remains, dozens of them. Small, brittle bones arranged with unnatural precision, skulls turned inward in a perfect circle, as if waiting for instruction. Each jaw had been wired shut, each mouth filled with muslin. The lead contractor halted work immediately and contacted county authorities. But before any report could be filed, the Blackwell estate intervened. A family attorney arrived with notarized papers, quietly paid every worker's fee in full, and demanded a signed statement of confidentiality. The chapel was bulldozed within a week. There was no investigation, no autopsies, no press. The incident became a footnote in city archives, labeled "unauthorized structural burial," a phrase as meaningless as it was evasive. But a single photo taken by a worker, smuggled and hidden for years, revealed more. Among the bones was a small doll, stitched from human hair and muslin, seated cross-legged in the center of the circle. Its eyes were closed, its mouth sewn. The implications were horrifying. This was not an accidental burial site. It was ritualistic, purposeful. The positioning suggested neither mass grave nor hasty disposal. It suggested choreography, intent. Ceremony. Religious scholars later speculated that the wired jaws and stuffed mouths indicated an effort to contain something, whether sound, spirit, or secret, no one could say. But the symbolism was clear. These children were not merely silenced in life, they were meant to remain silent in death. Beneath the house of God, they had built something else entirely, something that wore the shape of holiness but reeked of inversion. An altar not for worship, but for containment, for suppression, or perhaps for feeding. The chapel is gone, but what lay beneath it never truly left. Hidden within the estate's crumbling library was a single red leather ledger, wrapped in cloth and sealed with an iron clasp. It bore no title, no author, only a hand-carved emblem. A serpent eating its own tail, encircling the Latin phrase puritas per dolorem, purity through pain. Inside, the pages revealed what can only be described as a psychological blueprint, a manifesto authored by Dr. Elijah Blackwell himself. It was not a diary, it was doctrine. The text outlined a systematic belief that pain, isolation, and fear were essential tools for spiritual cleansing. Blackwell wrote of removing the rot from the soul through ritual interruption, a method he claimed could rewire the corrupted mind. He viewed emotions as infections and believed love, particularly parental affection, was the most insidious contaminant of the spirit. Children, in his eyes, were raw spiritual material, capable of being molded into vessels of perfect order through deprivation and recalibration. One passage described the stillness trials, a form of solitary confinement in absolute darkness where children were left with only a mirror and their thoughts. Another detailed breath fasting, where children were made to speak without inhaling until their faces turned blue and their voices vanished. To Dr. Blackwell, silence was not absence, it was purity, and obedience was divinity. Most disturbing were the margins. Tiny annotations, etched in different inks and often trembling in script, appeared beside certain methods. Names were listed, first names only, in descending columns. One page had 12 names. Another had 23. The final entry simply read, "All accounted for, progress made." The doctrine was never published, never submitted to any scientific board, but it spread quietly. Copies were found decades later in private collections, cult libraries, and among the ruins of a South American orphanage that bore Blackwell's crest. The ideas metastasized into movements. Echoes of the doctrine appeared in underground therapy circles in the 1940s, and even in certain intelligence programs that experimented with sensory deprivation. The Blackwell doctrine wasn't just theory, it was application. And in the wrong hands, it offered a framework for sanctioned cruelty, pain, ritualized and disguised as treatment, silence, reframed as salvation, and innocence, erased as a necessary cost. This wasn't madness, it was method, and its fingerprints stretch far beyond the walls of the estate. In 1956, decades after the Blackwell estate was sealed and declared unsafe, a local journalist named Miriam Langston acquired a crate from a silent auction, one of many that had been left unclaimed in a county storage unit. Most bidders overlooked it. It was unmarked, water-damaged, and smelled faintly of mildew. But what Langston found inside would haunt her for the rest of her life. The crate held over 300 glass plate negatives, fragile, ghostly images preserved from the estate's private collection. Most were portraits, not of the family, but of the children. Rows of them, lined up like specimens, same pose, same hollow eyes, same absence of expression. Some were gagged, some had their mouths sewn shut. One had a number stitched onto his shirt, 1001. In later frames, the same child appeared again, his number increasing. His face, however, was slowly vanishing, his features blurred, as if deliberately smeared or exposed too long. In other photographs, instruments could be seen in the background, old medical tools, jars filled with suspended matter, and drawings on blackboards behind them, symbols, charts, anatomical diagrams that didn't quite align with any known physiology. One wall bore the phrase, "Return the shape to order," scrawled again and again, hundreds of times. Langston attempted to publish her findings, but no outlet would touch it. One editor told her, "This isn't journalism, it's contagion." Days later, her apartment was ransacked. Nothing stolen except the negatives, but Langston, prepared for resistance, had all ready-made prints. She buried them in a safety deposit box, leaving a letter that would surface upon her death decades later. That letter began, "They tried to erase them, but we are not meant to forget." Experts who have since reviewed the photos noted a disturbing consistency in the lighting and pupil dilation. Someone was monitoring reactions, measuring trauma. One print was labeled, "Stimulus 4, absence of sound after prolonged screaming." Even now, the surviving images circulate in fringe circles, dark corners of the internet where trauma and art collapse into each other. But what they represent is not aesthetic. It's evidence, deliberate documentation of systemic cruelty, preserved like trophies. The Blackwells didn't just experiment in the dark. They curated it, framed it, and tried to immortalize it before history could bury their sins. Her name was never confirmed, no birth certificate, no census match, only a first name scrawled in a staff ledger, Eleanor. She arrived at the Blackwell estate in the spring of 1891, dropped off by a woman who refused to give her own name. Eleanor was 7 years old, with jet black hair that hung like wet silk and a tendency to hum lullabies in languages no one recognized. But it wasn't her voice that unnerved the staff, it was how she moved, always backwards, always slow, as if she was trying to unlive something. At first, they thought it was a behavioral tic, a form of defiance or trauma response. But Eleanor refused to walk forward. Even when punished, even when locked in the observation attic for 3 days with no food, she would pace in reverse. One note in the Blackwell logs reads, "She will turn her head, but not her body. She looks at you like she's seen your ending." Other children began to mimic her. First 1, then 5, then 12. When asked why, they all gave the same answer. "She's going somewhere safer." One night, Eleanor vanished. No doors opened, no windows broken, just a trail of wet footprints pointed inward, toward the center of the house. They led to a sealed crawl space beneath the chapel where no child had ever been allowed. Inside was nothing but dust, no sign of her, no remains, just a strange symbol etched into the dirt floor, a spiral, spiraling inward endlessly. When a priest was called to bless the site, he stopped halfway through the rite, dropped his Bible and muttered, "She wasn't trying to escape, she was trying to reverse something." Years later, when the estate was being cleared, workers found dozens of stick figure drawings taped to the underside of Eleanor's bunk. Each figure walked backward. Each was missing a face. To this day, local folklore claims that if you walk backward from the estate gates to the tree line at midnight, you'll hear humming behind you. And if you turn around, she'll show you what she was walking away from. Eleanor was one child among many, but her presence, her defiance of direction, suggests the experiments may have fractured more than minds. Perhaps they tore something open, and she was the only one who knew how to seal it. The Blackwell estate, once sprawling across 120 acres of secluded forest land, was held under one of the most convoluted inheritance agreements in 19th century Missouri. The original deed, signed in 1842 by Patriarch Elias Blackwell, contained a clause so unusual that legal scholars have since questioned whether it was ever enforceable. Ownership of the grounds shall only pass to blood, unbroken, undiluted. No one could explain what that meant, and no legal body ever challenged it. But what's most disturbing isn't the language itself, it's that the clause disappeared from all later versions of the will. Early legal transcripts show it. Witnesses confirmed it, and yet, by the time the estate changed hands after the death of Franklin Blackwell in 1911, the clause was simply gone, replaced by a single line, to be inherited by those who remember. What does that mean? Who remembers? And what happens to those who forget? Records show that in the years following Franklin's death, 3 potential heirs were institutionalized after visiting the property. 1. Nathaniel Blackwell, a cousin who lived in Boston, spent only one night on the grounds before writing 78 pages of what his doctors would later call incoherent ancestral panic. The only repeated phrase throughout the document was, "I see their eyes when I close mine." Another heir, Rebecca Blackwell Turner, filed a formal petition to reject her inheritance, claiming the estate held memories that are not mine but demand to be carried. She died of a brain aneurysm 2 weeks later, but the attending physician noted she had written something on her hospital bed tray just before collapsing. It read, "Not blood, not mine, but it wants me." To this day, no one knows who ultimately claimed ownership after Franklin. The paper trail ends abruptly in 1913. The estate was left unoccupied, slowly decaying into myth. But rumors among surviving Blackwell descendants whisper of a keeper, someone chosen not through law, but through memory, someone who didn't forget. The missing clause isn't just a legal anomaly. It suggests an inheritance of burden, not wealth. A transference not of property, but of secrets so heavy they deform the mind. Whatever the Blackwells did, they buried it beneath layers of false lineage and legal erasure. But the estate remained, and someone kept its doors from rotting shut. It began with a simple renovation. In 1924, a preservation society attempted to restore parts of the eastern wing of the Blackwell estate, intending to convert it into a local history museum. Workers pulling up rotted floorboards in what had once been the children's quarters discovered 2 small indentations in the dirt, too symmetrical, too deliberate. They assumed it was an animal burrow, until they found the ribbons. 2 faded blue ribbons, identical, tied in perfect bows, and preserved in a manner that defied the damp and rot around them. Beneath the soil, buried less than 2 feet down, were the skeletal remains of 2 children, twins. Their arms were wrapped around each other, their spines curved inward like they'd been bracing for something. No official identity was ever confirmed, but local rumor had long spoken of the Echo pair, 2 pale siblings who never spoke, never ate, and never blinked. Ledgers from the 1880s mention them once. Assigned to isolation wing, inseparable, mimicry increasing. What that meant was unclear, until investigators found the final journal of a Blackwell nurse, hidden inside the frame of a nursery mirror. In it, she describes the twins speaking in perfect synchrony, copying not only the words but the breath and tremor of whoever spoke near them. She wrote, "When I cried, they cried with my voice. When I begged them to stop, it was my own pleading I heard back." The nurse claimed she once saw the pair standing at the foot of her bed, mouthing words she hadn't spoken yet. "They knew my nightmares before I dreamt them." Her entries end abruptly, but a page torn from her Bible was found nailed inside the floorboards, above the burial site. On it, one sentence was scrawled, "Do not separate the mirror." Who buried them, and why, remains unknown. But one photo exists, locked in an archival drawer mislabeled Found Objects, 1925. It shows this with two skeletons, arms entwined. Behind them, scratched faintly into the plaster wall, is a message in a child's hand. We didn't copy. We remembered. The restoration effort was abandoned. That wing was sealed. To this day, no local contractor will take a job involving the floorboards of the East Wing. They say you can still hear voices, your own, whispering what you were about to think. Atop the crumbling west turret of the Blackwell estate hangs a rusted bell, its origin undocumented, its purpose unclear. For decades, locals called it the Morning Bell, though no one remembers why. Mounted without a visible striker or rope, it should have been inert. And yet, from 1891 to 1903, townsfolk documented over a dozen instances where the bell rang violently in the dead of night, always during windless hours, always in threes. The local newspaper, the Darrington Post, published a piece in 1894 after the third unexplained ringing, suggesting it signaled a death within the family. The timing matched. Each tolling corresponded with the death of a Blackwell child. But the coroner's records show something far stranger. The bell always rang before the child died, in some cases by hours, in others by days. One chilling example was 10-year-old Lydia Blackwell. The bell rang at precisely 2:14 a.m. on September 9, 1896. Lydia died 3 days later, drowned in a dry well. Her mother, Celeste, reportedly suffered a complete psychological break afterward. Her journal, discovered in a weather-warped trunk in the attic, records an entry dated the morning after the bell. I saw her hands on the window pane, but Lydia was still asleep. A final note, scratched in frantic handwriting. It rings for what's already here. When repairmen attempted to remove the bell in 1910, they found it fused to the support beam by what looked like calcified root matter. Every attempt to cut through it failed. Saws dulled, blades snapped. The workers refused to return. In 1963, a group of college students trespassed on the property and recorded audio of the bell. Their tape, preserved in a university archive, is chilling, not because of the ringing, but because of what follows. A faint whisper, barely audible, layered beneath the chime. It's not for the dead. It's for the ones who wait. Analysis confirmed no manipulation, no second voice, just something embedded in the toll. Since then, the bell has rung only once, on a still night in 1977. The caretaker's dog was found dead the next morning, eyes open, facing the tower. To this day, the bell remains untouched. No wind moves it, no animal nests inside it. Yet at night, if you walk beneath the west tower, some say you can feel the air bend, like sound waiting to form. Behind the Blackwell estate, past the weeping elms and rusted fencing, lies a walled garden that defies every season. The soil is thick and black, often damp even in drought. The air there is warmer, unnaturally so, and the plants bloom year-round. Roses flourish in winter. Ivy coils like muscle around dead stone. Botanists who've studied the garden describe the vegetation as aggressively fertile, resistant to disease, decay, even pruning, but none of them stayed long. The garden was first designed by Nathaniel Blackwell's second wife, Evelyn, who arrived in 1871 with a love for herbalism and a suspicion of doctors. She claimed plants could speak, that some preferred blood over water. Neighbors dismissed her as eccentric until the incidents began. Children who wandered into the garden often emerged hours later, dazed, unable to speak for days. One girl, Esther Linney, reportedly lost all her fingernails within 24 hours. Her parents said she kept whispering, "It feeds when we bleed." No animal has ever been seen inside the garden. Birds avoid it. Insects die the moment they cross the threshold. After Evelyn's death, the family tried to clear the space. Workers cut down the hedges and uprooted half the flower beds, but within 3 weeks, everything regrew. Thicker, wilder. One laborer swore he saw a shape moving beneath the roots, as if the dirt itself were breathing. In 1922, a team from a local university came to study the soil. Their report noted high traces of iron and phosphorus consistent with grave sites, but no official graves were registered on the property. A week later, the lead researcher fell ill and died of sepsis after a minor scratch became infected. His assistant never spoke publicly again. Her private notes, obtained years later, include one line underlined 3 times. "It accepts sacrifice." Today, the garden is locked behind iron gates, but locals swear it still pulses. Flowers there bloom in unnatural symmetry, roses with too many petals, vines that twist into perfect knots. Some nights, especially around solstice, witnesses claim to hear a low hum coming from beneath the soil. Others say it sounds more like a lullaby. The Blackwell family crest, engraved in stone at the center of the garden, remains untouched by time or weather. Its motto reads, "What is buried may still bloom." Deep within the east wing of the Blackwell estate lies a small, windowless chamber sealed by a warped oak door. Its original purpose is unknown, no architectural plans list it, and the walls surrounding it appear thicker than standard. Locals call it the Whispering Room, a name passed down through generations of housekeepers, most of whom refused to speak about what they heard inside. It was Evelyn Blackwell who first locked the room. In her diaries, she refers to it only as the chamber that answers. She wrote of strange sensations when standing near its door, pressure in the ears, a taste of copper on the tongue, a need to whisper secrets aloud. When she did, she claimed the room whispered back, not in words, but in understanding, in permission. Several generations of Blackwells were rumored to have used the room for confession, though no priest ever entered it. One account describes young Matilda Blackwell locking herself inside for 3 days. When she emerged, her eyes were bloodshot, and she had carved symbols into her own palms, symbols identical to ones later found etched beneath the floorboards in that very room. During renovations in 1934, a construction team removed the outer wall in an attempt to expand the hallway. They stopped immediately when they heard voices behind the sealed door. Not yelling, whispering, multiple voices, speaking in what sounded like backward English. The lead worker fled and later burned all the blueprints of the wing. When pressed, he told his supervisor, "You don't build over something that still breathes." Recordings made in the room during the 1970s reveal an audio anomaly, a constant low-frequency hum just above human hearing. When slowed down, portions resemble spee. Etch. Audio engineers extracted fragments. Say it. Again. And most disturbingly, "I already know." All words came with no speaker present. Paranormal researchers have tried to document the room's effects. All report vivid nightmares, nosebleeds, and an unshakable compulsion to speak personal truths aloud while inside. Several visitors left with no memory of what they said. The room is now permanently sealed with iron reinforcements and blessed salt, but sometimes when the estate is quiet, caretakers say they hear the faint sound of someone whispering their own name. And worse, an answer. When Patriarch Nathaniel Blackwell died in 1901, his funeral was a private affair. No obituary, no public ceremony, no known grave. But what truly unsettled the town wasn't his death. It was what followed. No legal will was ever found, no succession plan, no trust documentation, no letter left behind. And yet, within 48 hours, power passed seamlessly to his eldest son, Edward Blackwell, as if the transition had been agreed upon long before by means other than paper and ink. Family staff later revealed there had been a reading of sorts, held not by a lawyer, but by Edward himself, alone in the mansion's upper library. He emerged pale and trembling, clutching a leather-bound volume no one had seen before. That night, all mirrors in the house were turned inward, facing the walls. Edward claimed it was tradition. Despite no legal will, the state didn't intervene. Judges were paid off. Land titles mysteriously updated. A local attorney who tried to contest the inheritance on behalf of a distant cousin died in a carriage accident 2 days later. His office was burned to the ground within the week. Over the decades, several researchers have tried to piece together what the unwritten will might have entailed. What pact had been made in shadow that allowed the family to operate without legal scrutiny for over a century? Some point to a strange clause in an 1897 land deed referring to custodianship of the inheritance not written in language. Others cite the sudden silence of a nun who once worked as governess to the children. She took a vow of complete silence after resigning and never spoke another word until her death. One theory suggests the will wasn't a document but a ritual, one passed down in blood, sealed not with ink but with silence and sacrifice. A former housekeeper described the Blackwell heirloom box, passed from father to son. Inside wasn't gold or silver, but ash, a tooth, and a single strand of braided hair. The Blackwell line never broke. Not through war, disease, or scandal. Each heir took control precisely when needed, without challenge, without question. No outsider ever stood between a Blackwell and their birthright. It was as if the house itself, alive, watchful, chose its master, and it never chose wrong. By 1922, whispers had begun about the other children of the Blackwell line, those not listed in family registries, those never seen at town gatherings or schoolhouses. Most chilling among them were the rumored twins, a boy and a girl, born under unusual circumstances and said to have lived their entire lives in the attic of the estate. No birth records exist, no photographs. Just fragments of eyewitness accounts from maids who never returned for a second week of work. They were described as pale, impossibly quiet, always together. Their language was private, a series of guttural sounds and synchronized blinking patterns. One cook recalled delivering food to a tray left outside the attic door. Once she caught a glimpse. 2 figures seated cross-legged behind the frosted glass, unmoving, as if carved from wax. The twins were never named. Family logs marked them only as the upstairs silence. According to letters found in a priest's archive, Evelyn Blackwell referred to them as my reminder and my debt. One diary entry ends with, "They are not cursed. They are the price." Rumors spread that the twins were not siblings, but one soul split in 2. That they spoke in dreams, appearing at the foot of beds, whispering family secrets into the ears of distant relatives across the country. One man in Ohio claimed he saw them in a fevered vision, only to receive a letter days later confirming a death in the Blackwell family on the same night. The attic was eventually boarded shut after a series of unexplained events. Furniture dragged across the ceiling in the dead of night, blood dripping through floorboards onto the dining table below. a child's laughter echoing through the vents when no children were present. When the estate changed hands briefly during a tax dispute in the 1960s, investigators found a small pair of identical wooden chairs in the attic, placed side by side, facing a blank wall. Both were warm to the touch. On the floor lay two silver lockets, each with the same inscription. "We remember." No bodies were ever found. No remains. Just those two chairs, always facing the same wall, unmoving. Some say the twins still dwell there, watching, waiting, listening for the moment the house calls their names again. Elise Blackwell was the last known daughter born into the family before its name began to fade from public record. Born in 1931 and described as incandescent by her tutors, Elise was known for her musical talent, her quiet defiance of family customs, and her haunting tendency to wander the estate grounds barefoot, humming lullabies no one had taught her. Her presence unsettled the elders, especially her refusal to enter the east wing of the house, claiming it moved when no one looked. By 17, Elise had begun keeping a diary. Fragments of it, found decades later hidden in the piano bench, spoke of the knocking inside the walls and the hallway that doesn't appear in mirrors. Her writings hinted at a secret she had uncovered, something involving her great-uncle's sealed study, and a letter marked "Do not open unless you remember." In the spring of 1950, Elise vanished. No note, no signs of struggle. She was last seen walking into the garden maze at dusk. She never emerged. Police searched the grounds, drained the pond, combed through every room of the estate. Nothing, not even a shoe print. But 3 days later, her mother, Evelyn, received a parcel. Inside was Elise's favorite violin, snapped in half, and a lock of her hair tied with a red ribbon. No return address, just a single phrase etched into the inside of the parcel. She chose to stay. The family declared her dead in absentia 5 years later. But townsfolk reported strange occurrences afterward. A girl matching Elise's description seen standing at the attic window, music drifting from the grand piano at night, melodies Elise had composed but never played aloud, children who snuck onto the girl. Aun swore they heard someone humming from within the garden hedges. One groundskeeper claimed to have seen her, still 17, still barefoot, staring at him from beneath the stone archway at dawn. When he approached, she simply faded like fog in morning light. To this day, her room remains untouched, the bed still made, the mirror still veiled. A single candle burned there every year on the night she disappeared, until the last Blackwell heir finally extinguished it for good. But they say if you walk the garden path after dark and hum the tune she never finished, someone might just hum it back. In 1974, following the death of Charles Blackwell, the last official patriarch of the family, the estate prepared for what was expected to be a modest, private funeral. But what transpired instead deepened the Blackwell legend into something almost mythic. His will, cryptic and stained with what experts believed was blood, contained a final request. "Do not bury me beside my ancestors. Bury me where the truth cannot dig." The family plot behind the estate held generations of Blackwells, their headstones increasingly eroded, inscriptions half lost to moss and time. But Charles's grave remained conspicuously absent. Instead, a group of hired men, reportedly from out of state, arrived in unmarked trucks just before midnight. They were seen hauling a sealed iron casket into the woods beyond the estate, toward an area long rumored to have once held the original gallows from the land's darker pre-colonial days. No death certificate was filed for months. When one finally surfaced, the cause of death was listed as involuntary silence. No medical clarification, no autopsy. The priest meant to deliver Charles's eulogy resigned the day before the funeral, citing irreconcilable spiritual compromise. He never spoke publicly again. And yet, townsfolk reported a second service held days later, not in the open, not in daylight, but deep within the ruined chapel on the far edge of the estate, a place long abandoned, its roof collapsed, its altar scorched. Witnesses claimed to hear chanting, low, guttural, and not entirely human. One claimed to see figures holding candles made of bone, swaying in perfect rhythm. Another heard a woman weeping from underground. Years later, a group of urban explorers ventured into those same woods. What they found was not a grave, but a circle of scorched earth and 7 upright stones, each etched with a single letter that, when arranged, spelled forgive. No casket, no remains, but one of the stones bled when touched, dark red, thick and warm. No one returned for a second exploration. Whether Charles was ever buried remains unknown, but his absence became more telling than any grave, because in the years that followed, the house grew colder, doors no longer stayed shut, mirrors showed reflections that didn't belong, and someone or something kept writing his name in the dust that settled on untouched furniture, as if he was still there, watching, waiting to be found. After Charles Blackwell's cryptic disappearance from both life and record, his remaining legal affairs were expected to be straightforward until the will was read aloud. The document, over 60 pages long and written entirely by hand, included a final clause that froze the room into silence. The house must never be sold. It must choose its next keeper, and should any outsider claim it, they must spend 1 full night inside alone before ownership is granted. Lawyers scoffed. Judges tried to nullify the clause. But every time someone attempted to circumvent it, files went missing, signatures vanished, and once, an entire courthouse caught fire under mysterious circumstances. By the time the dust settled, no one wanted to touch the estate, legally or otherwise. Still, over the years, a few did try. In 1982, a wealthy antique dealer from Chicago offered triple the market value. He was last seen entering the Blackwell home on a stormy November evening. He never made it to sunrise. His car remained parked out front, engine cold. Inside, nothing was disturbed except the mirrors, all cracked from the inside. His body was never found, though his watch was discovered weeks later, submerged in a sink filled with water that had no plumbing attached. In 1996, a historical society proposed converting the estate into a museum. The project died after 3 committee members reportedly experienced recurring bleeding in dreams. One lost their sight for exactly 3 days. Another disappeared mid-presentation while speaking about Elise Blackwell. His microphone recorded 13 minutes of static punctuated by a single voice whispering, "She's still in the maze." By 2010, the house was blacklisted, not sold, not condemned, simply left to itself. But that same year, an anonymous bidder from overseas attempted the clause. A woman, early 40s, never named. She entered the house on New Year's Eve. She emerged at dawn, changed. Neighbors said her hair had gone white. She moved into the house, never spoke to anyone, never left. But lights began to appear in rooms long thought dead. The piano played again, and the garden once withered bloomed blood-red roses that weren't planted. No one knows what she saw, but locals whisper that the house finally found someone willing to carry its memory and its madness. They say every legacy comes with a cost. She paid it, and now she tends the maze. The Blackwell family is gone, but not erased. Their story doesn't rest in peace. It lingers, like a draft through a locked room, or the faint smell of fire where no flames burn. The estate still stands, a monument to generations of cruelty polished into civility, of secrets passed like heirlooms, and of a darkness so refined it learned how to smile. What began as land soaked in colonial blood became a home where lineage replaced love, and rituals replaced faith. Children disappeared behind its walls, heirs vanished or went mad, and history rewrote itself in whispers. And yet, something always remained. A presence, a pattern, a legacy not just of blood, but of design. The final portrait still hangs in the Blackwell parlor, no name etched beneath, just a woman, eyes too large, smile too soft, fingers resting over a child's shoulder, but the child's face is missing, scratched out with perfect symmetry. The canvas is old, but the scratches are fresh, always fresh. Visitors say the portrait changes, that the background shifts slightly, that the child sometimes reappears, but never with the same face. One woman claimed the child looked exactly like her daughter. Another screamed that it was her daughter, and still the house waits. Not for another victim, but for someone to understand what the Blackwells always believed, that history isn't what we bury, it's what we invite back in. You wanted to know their secret. You wanted to walk their halls, trace their footsteps, breathe the air they left behind. Now you have. But be careful what you remember, because memory is a door, and the Blackwell family, they never really learned how to close it.